Tonight, as the day quietly fades away, you're invited to slow your breathing, to let your shoulders relax, and to rest your mind in a true story from America's past. This is not a story meant to excite or disturb. It's a gentle historical reflection, one that can simply be listened to or drifted through. As sleep gradually finds you, if calm history like this helps you rest, you're welcome to subscribe so these quiet stories are always here for you at night. And if you feel comfortable, you may leave a comment sharing where you're listening from, a city, a town, or even just a quiet room somewhere in America. As the night deepens, we'll explore a forgotten moment after World War II when unity felt possible, when cooperation seemed within reach, and when a hopeful vision quietly slipped away. You don't need to stay awake. Just listen, and let the story carry you gently into sleep. In the quiet weeks that followed the end of the Second World War, the United States found itself standing at an unfamiliar threshold. The long years of uncertainty, rationing, and fear had finally come to an end. Church bells rang, factory whistles fell silent, and families gathered around radios to hear words that many had barely dared to imagine. The war was over. Across cities, towns, and rural communities, a deep collective exhale seemed to pass through the nation. Streets that had once echoed with urgency now carried a gentler rhythm. For the first time in years, Americans allowed themselves to think not in terms of survival, but of tomorrow. There was relief, certainly, but there was also something quieter and more profound. Shared sense that the country had endured together. Millions of servicemen and women began the slow journey home. Trains rolled across the continent, carrying young faces that had aged too quickly. At stations large and small, families waited patiently, holding flowers, homemade signs, and sometimes only hope. These reunions were not loud celebrations. More often, they were tender moments of stillness, tight embraces, quiet tears, and the simple comfort of being together again. At home, daily life resumed in gentle stages. Ration books were folded away. Store shelves slowly filled. Factories that had once produced tanks and aircraft shifted back to appliances, automobiles, and building materials. The nation's immense industrial energy, once focused on war, now turned toward peace. There was a widespread belief that if Americans could mobilize so effectively to defeat a global threat, they could surely build a fair and stable society in its aftermath. This feeling extended beyond economics or politics. It was emotional, almost spiritual. People had shared sacrifice, blackouts, shortages, loss, and those shared experiences created a rare sense of connection. Neighbors knew one another. Community halls were active. Local newspapers spoke in the language of rebuilding and cooperation. The future felt open, not yet crowded with divisions. For many Americans, this moment carried the quiet promise of renewal. The hardships of the Great Depression were still close in memory, but they no longer felt permanent. Instead, there was a sense that the country had learned something essential, that collective effort could overcome even the darkest challenges. Unity, for a brief time, seemed less like an abstract ideal and more like a lived experience. Veterans returned with dreams that were modest but deeply felt. They wanted steady work, safe homes, and families rooted in peace rather than uncertainty. Government programs helped many attend college, purchase homes, or start small businesses. These opportunities reinforced the belief that the nation was committed to rewarding sacrifice with stability. Hope settled into everyday routines. In cities, construction cranes rose slowly against the skyline. In suburbs, new streets appeared where fields had once been. In small towns, familiar rhythms resumed: school bells, evening dinners, quiet conversations on front porches. Life did not suddenly become perfect, but it felt manageable, predictable, calm. The media of the time reflected this mood. Radio broadcasts softened in tone. Magazines featured images of families, homes, and community life. The language of emergency faded, replaced by words like progress, cooperation, and responsibility. While disagreements certainly existed, they did not yet dominate the national conversation. There was space for patience. Importantly, this sense of unity was not naive. Americans were aware of the challenges that had economic transitions. global responsibilities, and unresolved social inequalities. But there was a prevailing belief that these problems could be addressed gradually, thoughtfully, and together. The trauma of war had made conflict feel costly, not just abroad but at home as well, internationally. Many Americans hoped the post-war world would be different from the one that had led to such devastation. There was cautious optimism that cooperation between nations might prevent future conflicts. At home, this translated into a broader confidence in dialogue and compromise. Unity was not seen as uniformity, but as shared purpose. As evenings grew quiet, families gathered in living rooms warmed by soft lamplight. Children played on the floor. Parents spoke in hushed voices about plans, savings, and dreams, long postponed. The pace of life slowed, and with it came reflection. People looked back on what had been lost and forward to what might finally be possible. This was the dawn of a moment that history would later describe as fleeting. But in that immediate afterglow, it felt real and enduring. Americans were not yet divided by rigid lines of ideology or fear. Instead, they were bound by memory of sacrifice, cooperation, and survival. For a brief period, the nation rested together, not in triumph, but in quiet gratitude. The war was over. The future was unwritten, and unity, however fragile, felt within reach. And as night settled over the country, there was a shared sense, soft and unspoken, that peace, at least for now, had come home. In the months following the end of the Second World War, a quiet and steady hope settled across the United States. It was not loud or triumphant. Instead, it lived in small gestures, everyday conversations, and the unspoken understanding that the nation had passed through something immense together. For a brief moment, Americans shared a sense of common purpose that felt natural rather than forced. This feeling did not emerge from speeches alone. It grew out of experience. During the war years, people had adjusted their lives in countless ways for the collective good. They saved scraps of metal, planted victory gardens, accepted rationing, and worked long hours in factories or offices far from the front lines. These actions, repeated daily, created habits of cooperation. When peace arrived, those habits did not disappear overnight. Across the country, people believed that shared effort could now be redirected toward building a better society. There was a widespread assumption that unity, once proven possible, could be sustained. This belief was less about ideology and more about trust that institutions could function, that neighbors would contribute, and that progress would be shared in workplaces. Many employees returned with renewed expectations. They had seen what organized effort could achieve. Factories that once produced military equipment had demonstrated efficiency on an unprecedented scale. It seemed reasonable to imagine that the same coordination could improve housing, education, and infrastructure. The idea of national purpose extended beyond defense and into daily life. Community life reflected this optimism. Civic organizations saw rising participation. Town meetings were well attended. Churches, unions, and veterans groups offered spaces for connection and dialogue. These gatherings were often quiet and practical, focused on local needs rather than grand debates. The tone was patient. People listened. Media outlets, too, reinforced the sense of shared direction. Newspapers spoke of rebuilding and responsibility. Radio programs emphasized stability and cooperation. The language of emergency gradually gave way to the language of stewardship, of caring for what had been preserved through sacrifice. Even disagreement, when it occurred, tended to be framed as part of a larger effort to improve the nation rather than divide it. For many Americans, this period felt like a rare alignment between personal goals and national direction. Individuals wanted security, meaningful work, and peaceful lives. The country, it seemed, wanted the same. This alignment reduced tension. There was less pressure to compete aggressively, less fear that someone else's gain required another's loss. The future felt expandable, not scarce. Importantly, this hope was shaped by memory. The Great Depression had taught Americans the cost of disunity and neglect. The war had demonstrated the power of coordination. Together, these experiences produced a cautious optimism, one that believed progress was possible but not guaranteed. Unity was valued precisely because people understood how fragile it could be. Education played a role in this atmosphere. Returning veterans enrolled in colleges and training programs in large numbers. Campuses became places not just of learning, but of shared experience. Students from different regions and backgrounds studied side by side, many for the first time. These interactions reinforced the idea that the nation's diversity could coexist within a common framework. In homes, conversations reflected similar themes. Families spoke about saving, planning, and contributing. Parents encouraged children to think about their place in a larger society. The language of we was common, not because it was mandated, but because it felt accurate. People believed they were part of something ongoing, something worth maintaining. On an international level, Americans were increasingly aware of their country's influence. There was a general desire to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past withdrawal, isolation, and neglect of global responsibility. While opinions varied on how involved the United States should be abroad, there was broad agreement that cooperation mattered. Peace was seen as something to be actively preserved, not passively assumed. This sense of common purpose also brought restraint. After years of conflict, many Americans were wary of extremes. They valued moderation, gradual change, and careful planning. Bold promises were met with interest, but also with caution. The goal was stability, not disruption. Unity, in this context, meant balance. Yet beneath this calm optimism, there was an awareness that unity required effort. It was not automatic. It depended on fairness, opportunity, and trust. People sensed that if these foundations weakened, the shared purpose might fade. Still, in these early post-war years, that possibility felt distant. Evenings during this period often carried a gentle rhythm. After dinner, families listened to the radio or sat quietly together. There was time to reflect. The pace of life, though busy, felt manageable. In this stillness, the idea of a shared future took root, not as a promise of perfection, but as a commitment to cooperation. This was the hope of a common purpose. The belief that Americans, having endured hardships side by side, could now move forward with patience and mutual respect. It was not a dramatic vision. It did not demand uniformity. It simply asked that progress be shared, that decisions be thoughtful, and that the lessons of recent history not be forgotten. For a brief time, this hope felt sufficient. It did not solve every problem, but it softened them. It allowed space for listening. And as the nation moved quietly through these early years of peace, that shared purpose lingered steady, fragile, and deeply human, waiting to see whether it would endure. In the early years following the Second World War, a new way of thinking quietly began to circulate through American public life. It was not loud, nor was it universally defined, but it carried a gentle ambition. Many people refer to it simply as the idea of one world. At its heart was a belief that peace, once achieved, could be preserved through cooperation rather than competition, and that the shared suffering of war might give rise to a more connected global future. For Americans who had watched events unfold across oceans and continents, the world no longer felt distant. Radio broadcasts, newsreels, and letters from abroad had made global affairs personal. The war had taught a clear lesson. What happened elsewhere could not be easily separated from life at home. The one world idea emerged from this realization, suggesting that international stability and domestic well-being were deeply linked. This vision did not reject national identity. Instead, it expanded it. Many Americans believed their country could remain strong while also participating in broader systems of cooperation. Institutions formed during the war years had shown that coordination across borders was possible. The hope was that these structures might evolve from instruments of necessity into foundations of lasting peace. In everyday conversations, the idea took simple forms. People spoke of understanding other nations rather than fearing them. Teachers introduced global perspectives in classrooms. Churches and civic groups discussed international responsibility alongside local concerns. The language was careful and measured, shaped by the memory of how quickly idealism had collapsed after the First World War. This time, many hoped lessons had been learned. The United Nations, newly established, became a symbol of this aspiration. While its practical impact was still uncertain, its existence alone suggested a shift in thinking. For the first time, there was an organized attempt to address global problems through dialogue rather than force. Americans followed these developments with cautious optimism, aware that cooperation required patience and compromise. Home. The one world idea aligned naturally with the recent experience of unity. The same cooperation that had mobilized factories and communities for war could, some believed, support peace. The emphasis was on prevention, preventing conflict, preventing economic collapse, preventing the cycles of resentment that had fueled earlier wars. It was a forward-looking vision, shaped as much by exhaustion as by hope. Political leaders, intellectuals, and journalists explored these ideas in speeches and writing. They spoke of interconnected economies, shared security, and mutual respect. While not everyone agreed on the details, there was a general openness to discussion. The tone remained calm, avoiding urgency or alarm. This was a period of reflection rather than confrontation. For many Americans, the appeal of the one world vision lay in its simplicity. It suggested that cooperation was not a weakness, but a practical response to modern reality. Advances in transportation and communication had made isolation increasingly unrealistic. The world, whether welcomed or not, had grown smaller. Working together seemed less like an ideal and more like a necessity. Economic considerations reinforced this perspective. The war had demonstrated the power of coordinated production and planning. Post-war reconstruction, both at home and abroad, appeared to require similar cooperation. There was a belief that shared prosperity could reduce conflict, and that economic stability was a foundation for peace. These ideas circulated quietly, shaping expectations without demanding immediate action. Culturally, the period encouraged curiosity rather than suspicion. American audiences watched foreign films, read translated literature, and listened to international music more than before. These experiences, though modest, contributed to a broader awareness of the world beyond national borders. Differences were noted, but they were not always framed as threats. Importantly, the one world ideal was not universally embraced. Some viewed it with skepticism, concerned about loss of autonomy or unclear obligations. Yet even among skeptics, there was often a recognition that the old patterns had failed. The debate, at this stage, remained largely respectful and measured. It reflected uncertainty rather than hostility. In private moments, many Americans simply hoped for a quieter future. They had lived through depression and war. The promise of stability, however imperfect, was deeply appealing. The one world idea offered reassurance that peace could be maintained. Through understanding rather than constant vigilance, it allowed people to imagine a world where children would not be shaped by the same fears. As nights grew quiet across the country, radios carried soft voices discussing international meetings and cooperative efforts. These broadcasts were not dramatic. They were informational, almost soothing. The absence of crisis itself felt like progress. The world was still complex, but it no longer seemed perpetually on the edge of disaster. This was the moment when the one world ideal took shape, not as a fixed policy, but as a shared mood. It existed in conversations, expectations, and the gentle belief that humanity might choose a different path. It did not promise perfection. It asked only for patience, dialogue, and the willingness to learn from recent history. For a time, that was enough. The idea rested quietly in the background of American life, offering a sense of direction without demanding certainty. It was a vision shaped by weariness and hope in equal measure, waiting to see whether the world and the nation would carry it forward, or slowly let it drift into memory. Asterisk in the quiet political landscape that followed the Second World War. A small number of public figures spoke in a tone that felt different from what Americans had come to expect. Their words were not shaped by urgency or fear, but by reflection. They did not promise dominance or victory. Instead, They spoke of understanding, cooperation, and the careful preservation of peace. Among these voices were two men from different political traditions, whose ideas briefly converged: Henry Wallace and Wendell Willkie. They were not obvious allies. Wallace emerged from a progressive tradition within the Democratic Party, shaped by New Deal idealism and a belief in economic fairness. Willkie, by contrast, had risen within Republican politics and had once challenged Franklin Roosevelt for the presidency. Yet in the aftermath of global conflict, both men arrived at similar conclusions about the future. The world, they believed, had reached a point where cooperation was no longer optional. For Wallace, the war had reinforced a conviction that peace depended on inclusion rather than exclusion. He spoke often about the dangers of dividing the world into rigid camps and argued that long-term stability required economic opportunity and mutual respect among nations. His language was measured, sometimes philosophical, and often forward-looking. He imagined a future where progress was shared rather than guarded. Willkie's journey too similar. Conclusions followed a different path. Having traveled widely during the war, he returned with a heightened awareness of how interconnected the modern world had become. He believed that isolation, once a viable stance, now carried serious risks. His reflections emphasized realism rather than idealism, suggesting that cooperation was simply the most practical response to global conditions. What made their voices notable was not just what they said, but how they said it. Both avoided inflammatory rhetoric. They spoke calmly, appealing to reason rather than emotion. In a period marked by exhaustion, this tone resonated with many Americans. People were not looking for confrontation. They were looking for reassurance that the future could be managed thoughtfully. Public response to these ideas was quiet but attentive. Wallace and Willkie were not leading mass movements, but they influenced conversations among policymakers, journalists, and ordinary citizens. Their speeches were discussed in newspapers and radio programs, often framed as thoughtful contributions rather than calls to action. This framing allowed their ideas to circulate without provoking immediate resistance. For a brief time, their perspectives aligned with the broader mood of the country. Americans were open to cooperation because they had seen its effectiveness during the war. The idea that former enemies could become partners was not yet dismissed as unrealistic. The memory of shared sacrifice softened skepticism, yet their visions also challenged familiar assumptions. Cooperation required trust, patience, and restraint. It asked Americans to think beyond immediate advantage and consider long-term consequences. While many appreciated this perspective, it also created unease. The transition from wartime unity to peacetime complexity was not simple. Within political institutions, these ideas encountered quiet resistance. Established structures tended to favor caution and predictability. The language of cooperation, though appealing, lacked clear boundaries. Some worried it underestimated potential threats. Others feared it diluted national priorities. These concerns were often expressed subtly, through procedural decisions rather than public debate. Wallace, in particular, found his influence gradually diminishing. His emphasis on international understanding and economic equity placed him at odds with emerging political strategies. Over time, his views were described as impractical or overly optimistic, not through direct confrontation, but through gradual exclusion from decision-making circles. Willkie's influence followed a different trajectory. Though respected for his wartime contributions, his call for sustained international engagement challenged long-standing habits within his party. As political alignments shifted, his ideas became less central. They remained present in discourse, but increasingly as reference points rather than guiding principles. Despite this, the significance of their voices lies in their timing. They articulated a possibility at a moment when the nation was receptive. They gave language to a hope that many felt but struggled to express. Their vision did not demand immediate transformation. It simply suggested a direction in quiet moments. Americans listening to these voices might have felt a sense of calm recognition. The idea that peace could be preserved through understanding aligned with personal desires for stability. After years of uncertainty, the promise of thoughtful cooperation felt comforting. As time passed, other concerns began to dominate public attention. Security, competition, and strategic positioning slowly replaced dialogue and patience. The voices of unity did not disappear abruptly. They faded gradually, overshadowed by new priorities. Yet their presence remains an important part of this historical moment. Wallace and Wilkie represent a crossroads, a brief interval when the nation considered a different approach. Their ideas remind us that history is not only shaped by what happens, but also by what is imagined, discussed, and then set aside. In the stillness of reflection, their words continue to echo softly, not as instructions, but as reminders. They speak of a time when cooperation felt possible, when unity was discussed without urgency, and when the future seemed open enough to allow thoughtful choices. For listeners resting tonight, this chapter of history offers a gentle pause. It invites consideration without judgment. It reminds us that voices of calm have always existed, even in uncertain times, and that their quiet presence has shaped the path of the nation in ways it's both seen and unseen. In the late 1940s, American public life entered a rare and gentle phase. It was not free of disagreement, but it was marked by restraint. The sharp edges of debate had softened, shaped by the shared memory of hardship and the quiet relief that followed the war's end. For a brief time, the nation moved through its days with an underlying sense that cooperation was both possible and preferable. Civic spaces reflected this mood. Town halls, libraries, and community centers became places of discussion rather than confrontation. People gathered not to demand change, but to consider it. Meetings often focused on practical matters: schools, housing, infrastructure issues that touched daily life and invited collaboration. The tone was measured, patient, and deliberate. Local newspapers played an important role in shaping this atmosphere. Headlines favored stability and rebuilding. Editorials encouraged responsibility and thoughtful progress rather than urgency. Journalists, many of whom had covered the war, wrote with an awareness of how fragile peace could be. Their language suggested care, reminding readers that words themselves carried weight. Radio, the dominant medium of the time, also contributed to this sense of calm. Broadcasts were steady and unhurried. News was delivered without dramatic emphasis. Commentary often sought balance, presenting multiple perspectives without framing them as threats. In the evenings, families gathered around their radios, listening together in shared silence. Political life, while active, felt less combative than it would in later decades. Public officials often spoke in broad terms about responsibility, recovery, and unity. Campaign rhetoric, though competitive, rarely questioned the legitimacy of opposing views. There was an assumption that disagreement did not require division. This period of consensus was shaped by exhaustion as much as optimism. After years of economic struggle and global conflict, Americans valued predictability. They preferred steady progress over rapid change. The idea of consensus offered reassurance that the nation would not be pulled abruptly in opposing directions. Education reflected this mindset. Schools emphasized civic responsibility and shared values. History lessons highlighted cooperation and collective achievement. Students were encouraged to see themselves as participants in an ongoing national story, one that required patience and respect. These lessons were delivered calmly, without urgency. Workplaces mirrored this atmosphere in subtle ways. Employers and employees alike sought stability. While tensions existed, they were often addressed through negotiation rather than confrontation. The memory of wartime coordination lingered, reinforcing the belief that cooperation was practical, not idealistic. Religious institutions also contributed to the sense of shared purpose. Sermons often focused on gratitude, humility, and service. Congregations supported local charities and community efforts. These activities reinforced connections across social and economic lines, creating quiet networks of mutual support. Importantly, this age of consensus did not erase differences. Economic inequality, racial injustice, and regional disparities remained. But these issues were often discussed cautiously, framed as long-term challenges rather than immediate crises. The prevailing belief was that steady progress, guided by shared values, would eventually address them. The absence of constant conflict allowed people to focus inward. Families planned for the future. Savings accounts grew. Home ownership increased. These personal milestones reinforced trust in institutions and in one another. Stability became a shared goal, linking individual aspirations with national direction. Cultural life reflected similar themes. Films, music, and literature often emphasized resilience, reconciliation, and everyday dignity. Stories centered on ordinary lives rather than dramatic upheaval. Audiences found comfort in narratives that mirrored their own desire for peace and predictability. This consensus extended, cautiously, to foreign affairs. While opinions varied, there was general agreement that global engagement should be approached thoughtfully. The trauma of war encouraged moderation. Americans were willing to listen, to wait, to consider consequences before acting. Yet this calm carried an unspoken fragility. Consensus depended on trust, and trust required maintenance. It relied on the belief that institutions would act fairly, that prosperity would be shared, and that voices would be heard. As long as these assumptions held, consensus felt natural. In quiet moments, however, subtle shifts were already beginning. Economic pressures, political realignments, and emerging global tensions weighted just beyond the edges of public awareness. They did not yet dominate conversation, but they existed, faintly like distant weather. For now, though Americans lived within this calm, evenings were unhurried. Conversations were thoughtful. Public life moved at a pace that allowed reflection. Disagreement existed, but it rarely overwhelmed connection. This brief age of consensus would not last. History rarely allows such moments to endure indefinitely, but its significance lies in its tone. It showed that a large, diverse nation could, even temporarily, choose patience over urgency and cooperation over division. As night settled across cities and towns, this shared, quiet-shaped daily life, it did not demand attention. It simply existed, steady and reassuring. And for a short while, that was enough. As the late 1940s unfolded, prosperity arrived quietly but steadily across much of the United States. It did not appear all at once, nor did it reach everyone equally, but its presence was felt in countless small ways. After years defined by scarcity and sacrifice, Americans began to experience a sense of material stability that had long seemed uncertain. This shift brought comfort, but it also carried new expectations. Factories that had once operated around the clock for wartime, production now turned their energy toward consumer goods. Automobiles, appliances, and household furnishings flowed into the market. Store windows displayed items that had been unavailable for years. For many families, purchasing these goods symbolized more than convenience. It marked a return to normal life. Employment levels remained high. Veterans entered the workforce alongside those who had kept industries running during the war. Wages rose modestly, and steady paychecks allowed families to plan beyond immediate needs. The fear of sudden unemployment, so vivid during the Great Depression, gradually loosened its hold on the national imagination. Housing became a central focus of this new prosperity. Neighborhoods expanded outward from cities, forming communities designed around stability and routine. Homes were modest but functional, built to accommodate growing families and long-term residents. These spaces fostered a sense of permanence, reinforcing the belief that the future could be predictable. Education also benefited from this moment. Colleges and training programs welcomed unprecedented numbers of students. Learning was framed as both opportunity and responsibility, an investment not only in individual success, but in national strength. This emphasis reflected a belief that prosperity should be sustained through preparation rather than chance. With these changes came rising expectations. Americans began to assume that progress would continue. Stability was no longer seen as temporary relief, but as a baseline. This shift subtly altered how people viewed institutions, leaders, and one another. Prosperity, once welcomed as a gift, began to feel like a promise. Daily routines reflected this growing confidence. Families planned vacations. Savings accounts expanded. Long-term goals, retirement, home improvements, education for children entered conversations more frequently. Life still required effort, but it felt less precarious. The sense of constant vigilance that had marked earlier decades eased, yet prosperity also introduced quiet pressures. As standards of living rose, so did comparisons. Communities measured themselves against one another. Expectations varied by region, occupation, and background. While many benefited, others felt the distance between promise and reality widening. These feelings often remained unspoken, existing beneath the surface of optimism. Workplaces changed as well. Employers sought efficiency and growth, responding to consumer demand. Employees expected fairness and opportunity, shaped by recent experiences of collective effort. The balance between productivity and well-being became a subtle point of tension. Though it was rarely framed as conflict during these early years, government programs continued to support expansion, reinforcing trust in public systems. Roads, schools, and utilities developed steadily. These visible improvements strengthened the belief that prosperity was not accidental, but managed. Americans generally viewed institutions as partners in progress. Cultural life echoed this mood. Popular stories emphasized success achieved through diligence and cooperation. Media portrayed stability as attainable and normal. These narratives reassured audiences that effort would be rewarded and that setbacks were temporary. Still, beneath this calm confidence, questions quietly formed. Could growth continue indefinitely? Would prosperity remain shared? These questions were not urgent, but they lingered. Rising expectations created new standards, and meeting those standards required constant adjustment. For many Americans, this period felt like a turning point. The hardships of the past receded into memory, while the future appeared open and manageable. Prosperity shaped identity, influencing how people understood success and security. The nation's self-image shifted from survival toward stewardship. Evenings during this time, often, carried a sense of contentment. Homes filled with soft light, radios played gently, and conversations turned toward plans rather than worries. Sleep came more easily to those who felt grounded in routine and supported by steady progress. Yet history reminds us that prosperity is never static. It reshapes expectations as much as it fulfills them. In this moment, Americans were learning what it meant to live with abundance after scarcity to trust. Continuity after disruption. This chapter of post-war life was neither triumphant nor complacent. It was thoughtful, measured, and quietly hopeful. Prosperity had arrived, and with it came a new challenge: sustaining balance, fairness, and trust in a nation adjusting to comfort after years of strain. As the country moved forward, these rising expectations would influence decisions large and small. For now, though, they rested gently within daily life promises, felt more than spoken. Waiting to see how the next chapters would unfold, as prosperity settled across much of the United States in the years after the Second World War. Daily life appeared steady and predictable. Stores were stocked, jobs were available, and communities expanded outward with confidence. Yet beneath this calm surface, subtle signs of economic tension began to emerge. These early shifts were quiet and often overlooked, but they played an important role in shaping the years that followed. The transition from a wartime to a peacetime economy was complex. Factories that had operated under centralized coordination now adjusted to market demands. While many workers welcomed the return of civilian production, the change brought uncertainty. Wartime wages and overtime declined, and expectations adjusted unevenly across industries. Labor shortages, once acute during the war, gave way to competition for jobs in certain regions. Returning veterans sought employment alongside those who had remained in the workforce. For most, opportunities were available, but not always in familiar roles or locations. These adjustments required flexibility. Not everyone experienced the transition smoothly in some workplaces. Discussions around wages and hours became more frequent. Employees who had contributed to the war effort felt a sense of earned stability, Employers, responding to changing markets, emphasized efficiency and cost control. These differing perspectives did not immediately lead to conflict, but they introduced a new tone to negotiations. Inflation also entered daily conversation. Prices for goods and services rose as demand increased. Families noticed the difference at grocery stores and gas stations. While incomes generally kept pace, the memory of past hardship made people attentive to changes in cost. Economic security, though present, felt conditional. Housing, a symbol of post-war stability, also revealed underlying pressure. Demand outpaced supply in many areas, leading to rising prices and crowded markets. Communities expanded rapidly, sometimes faster than infrastructure could support. These challenges were manageable, but they hinted at the limits of growth. For those who benefited most from prosperity, these tensions felt distant. But for others, particularly in regions dependent on specific industries, the future felt less certain. Economic change rarely unfolds evenly, and the post-war boom, while real, contained pockets of instability. Public discussion of these issues remained measured. Newspapers reported on labor negotiations and price trends without alarm. Government agencies monitored developments, seeking balance rather than intervention. The prevailing belief was that the system, having proven resilient, would adjust naturally. Yet the tone of economic conversation began to shift. Words like efficiency, productivity, and competition appeared more frequently. These concepts reflected a growing emphasis on performance and output, subtly altering how work and success were defined. In labor halls and management offices, discussions became more structured. Agreements were formalized, expectations clarified. While these changes aimed to provide stability, they also introduced formality into relationships that had once been shaped by shared wartime purpose. At home, families continued to plan and save, but with increased awareness of limits. Budgets were monitored. Purchases were considered carefully. Prosperity was enjoyed but not taken for granted. This cautious optimism reflected an understanding that economic conditions could change. Education and training were increasingly viewed as safeguards. Parents encouraged children to prepare for a competitive future. Skills and credentials gained importance, reinforcing the idea that security required adaptation. This mindset, while practical, also introduced quiet pressure. These early signs of tension did not dominate public life. They existed alongside confidence and growth, woven into daily routines rather than announced as crises. Americans adjusted gradually, trusting that balance could be maintained. In retrospect, these subtle shifts marked the beginning of a more complex economic landscape. The shared sense of wartime unity gave way to individualized concerns and strategies. Cooperation remained valued, but competition quietly reasserted itself. Evenings remained calm. Communities functioned. Life moved forward. Yet beneath the familiar rhythms, the economy was changing, introducing new expectations, new challenges, and new ways of thinking about work and security. For those listening tonight, this chapter reminds us that history often turns not on dramatic events, but on gradual adjustments. Economic tension does not always announce itself. Sometimes it settles gently, reshaping assumptions one small step at a time. In the afterglow of prosperity, Americans were learning how to navigate abundance with caution. The surface remained calm, but beneath it, the foundations were slowly shifting, preparing the ground for the next phase of the nation's story. As the post-war years continued, questions surrounding labor and fairness became part of the national conversation, though often in quiet and measured ways. These questions did not erupt suddenly, nor did they dominate daily life. Instead, they emerged gradually, shaped by changing expectations, economic adjustment, and the lingering memory of shared sacrifice during the war. During wartime, work had carried a clear purpose. Factories operated with urgency, and workers understood their roles as contributions to a collective goal. In the transition to peace, that shared urgency faded. What remained was a workforce accustomed to effort, discipline, and reliability. Many workers believed these qualities deserved recognition in the form of stability, fair compensation, and respect. Employers, on the other hand, faced a different set of concerns. Markets were reopening, competition was returning, and the predictability of government contracts was ending. Businesses needed to adapt quickly, balancing growth with sustainability. This shift required new approaches to management and planning, sometimes creating distance between decision-makers and employees. Labor. Organizations played an important role in navigating this transition. Unions, strengthened during the war years, sought to protect workers' interests while maintaining stability. Negotiations focused on wages, hours, and working conditions, often conducted through formal processes rather than public confrontation. The emphasis remained on dialogue. These discussions reflected broader questions about fairness. What constituted a fair wage in a growing economy? How should productivity gains be shared? To what extent should stability be guaranteed? These were not easily answered questions, and opinions varied widely, depending on experience and perspective. For many Americans, fairness was understood through personal experience. Those who had endured economic hardship valued predictability. They sought assurance that effort would be met with opportunity. This expectation did not always translate into specific demands, but it shaped attitudes toward work and institutions. Public discourse around labor remained cautious. Newspapers reported on negotiations without sensationalism. Government agencies monitored trends, aiming to balance growth and stability. The prevailing belief was that compromise, though sometimes difficult, was preferable to disruption. At the same time, the language of efficiency gained prominence. Productivity was framed as essential to national strength. While this emphasis encouraged innovation and growth, it also shifted focus away from shared experience toward measurable output. This subtle change influenced how work was evaluated and rewarded. In communities dependent on manufacturing or industry, these shifts were felt more directly. Changes in production methods altered routines. New technologies required adaptation. While these developments often improved efficiency, they also introduced uncertainty for workers accustomed to established roles. Families adjusted accordingly. Conversations around dinner tables included discussions of job security, advancement, and training. Education was increasingly viewed as a pathway to stability, reinforcing the idea that fairness was linked to preparation and adaptability. Despite these adjustments, many Americans continued to trust that the system would provide balance. The memory of collective effort during the war fostered patience. People believed that challenges could be addressed through cooperation and gradual reform. Yet, beneath this trust lay an awareness that fairness was not automatic. It required attention, negotiation, and willingness to listen. As prosperity grew, so did differences in experience. Ensuring that growth felt inclusive became an ongoing challenge. The question of labor and fairness was less about conflict than about definition. Americans were redefining what fairness meant in a new economic context. The answers varied, and the process was slow, but it reflected a society trying to adapt thoughtfully. In the evenings, after work and obligations, people rested with these questions quietly in mind. They did not always seek immediate solutions. Often, they simply wanted reassurance that their efforts mattered and that stability was within reach. This chapter of history reminds us that fairness is a living concept, shaped by circumstance and expectation. In the post-war years, Americans approached this question with caution and care, mindful of what had been endured and hopeful about what could be preserved. As the nation moved forward, these conversations would continue, influencing policy and practice. For now, they remained part of a broader effort to balance growth with dignity and effort unfolding slowly, thoughtfully, and largely out of the spotlight. As the United States settled into peacetime routines, its attention gradually turned outward once more. The war had ended, but its consequences extended far beyond national borders. Cities across Europe and parts of Asia lay damaged, economies strained, and populations displaced. For Americans, the question was no longer whether the nation would engage with the world, but how and to what extent. During the war, global involvement had been unavoidable. Decisions made overseas had immediate consequences at home. In the years that followed, many Americans believed this connection would remain. The idea that domestic stability depended, at least in part, on international recovery felt logical. A peaceful world, after all, seemed less likely to produce future conflict. Programs aimed at rebuilding war-torn regions reflected this belief. They were discussed not only as acts of generosity, but as investments in long-term stability. Helping other nations recover was seen by many as a way to prevent the conditions that had once led to economic collapse and unrest. This perspective emphasized prevention rather than reaction. At the same time, competing priorities emerged at home. Communities needed housing, infrastructure, and services. Veterans required support. Families hoped for improved schools and health care. As prosperity expanded, so did expectations for domestic investment. Balancing these needs with international commitments required careful judgment. Public opinion reflected this tension. While there was general support for global engagement, there was also caution. Americans remembered the period after the First World War, when international involvement had faded into isolation. This time, many wanted to remain engaged, but not at the expense of domestic well-being. Political leaders approached these decisions with measured language. They spoke of responsibility and balance, avoiding dramatic appeals. International assistance was framed as practical rather than idealistic, emphasizing shared benefit rather than sacrifice. This framing helped maintain public support without stirring urgency. Economic considerations played a central role. American industries benefited from stable global markets. Trade relationships promised growth, while instability abroad threatened disruption. These realities reinforced the idea that international involvement was closely tied to domestic prosperity. Yet this connection was not always visible in everyday life. For many Americans, global affairs remained abstract. News from abroad arrived through newspapers and radio, often summarized briefly. The distance between international policy and daily routines made it easy to prioritize local concerns. Within government, debates unfolded quietly. Budget allocations, strategic planning, and diplomatic initiatives required negotiation. These discussions were rarely dramatic, but they shaped the direction of national policy. The challenge lay in aligning long-term goals with immediate needs. Cultural attitudes toward the world also evolved. Americans became more aware of other societies through media and travel. But familiarity did not always translate into understanding. Curiosity coexisted with caution. The world felt closer, yet still distinct. For some, international engagement represented opportunity, a chance to lead, to influence, to contribute to stability. For others, it raised concerns about overextension and obligation. These differing perspectives did not yet polarize the nation, but they introduced complexity into the idea of unity. At home, families continued to focus on rebuilding their own lives. The connection between foreign policy and household security was not always clear. While leaders spoke of global responsibility, individuals measured progress through tangible improvements: jobs, homes, schools. This divergence between national strategy and personal experience required trust. Americans needed to believe that decisions made beyond their immediate view served a broader purpose. In the post-war years, that trust largely held, supported by recent memories of coordinated effort. Still, the balance was delicate. Too much emphasis on external commitments risked neglecting domestic needs. Too little risked instability abroad. Navigating this balance required patience and restraint, qualities shaped by recent history. As the decade progressed, the question of priorities grew more pressing. The world was changing rapidly, and the United States found itself in a position of unprecedented influence. How that influence would be used remained an open question. In the evenings, as Americans rested from daily routines, these decisions unfolded quietly in the background. They did not disrupt sleep or conversation, yet they shaped the environment in which families planned their futures. This chapter of history illustrates the complexity of leadership in a connected world. The United States faced choices that required balancing compassion with caution, ambition with restraint. These choices were not always visible, but they mattered deeply. For listeners tonight, this moment invites reflection on how nations weigh responsibility and care, both for their own people and for the wider world. It is a reminder that history often moves through quiet decisions made carefully, shaping paths that unfold slowly over time. As America looked outward, it also looked inward, carrying forward the hope that balance could be found and maintained. In a world still learning how to live with peace, in the years immediately following the Second World War, the Democratic Party found itself navigating a period of quiet transition. Victory abroad had brought pride and relief, but it also introduced uncertainty at home. The party that had guided the nation through depression and war now faced the challenge of redefining its purpose in a world no longer shaped by emergency. During the war years, unity had been a necessity. Differences within the party were often set aside in favor of coordination and resolve. Once peace arrived, those differences slowly resurfaced not as open conflict, but as questions about direction, priorities, and tone. The process was gradual and, for the most part, understated. At the center of these discussions was the balance between continuity and change. Some party leaders believed the post-war period called for caution and stability. They emphasized maintaining public confidence, managing economic growth carefully, and avoiding abrupt shifts that might unsettle a nation eager for calm. Their language reflected reassurance rather than ambition. Others within the party held a different view. They believed the end of the war presented a rare opportunity to extend the principles of cooperation and fairness that had guided wartime policy. These voices spoke of economic inclusion, international understanding, and the long-term benefits of shared progress. Their approach was thoughtful, but it required sustained commitment. Among those associated with this perspective was Henry Wallace, whose ideas continued to circulate even as his influence diminished. Wallace represented a strand of thought that emphasized global cooperation and domestic equity as mutually reinforcing goals. His arguments were not framed as urgent demands, but as reflections on lessons learned, as the party adjusted to new leadership and new circumstances. These perspectives were weighed carefully. Decision-makers considered public mood, geopolitical uncertainty, and economic realities. The prevailing conclusion leaned toward moderation. Stability, it was believed, would preserve unity more effectively than experimentation. This shift did not involve dramatic confrontations or public declarations. Instead, it unfolded through appointments, policy emphasis, and strategic silence. Certain ideas were discussed less frequently. Others gained prominence. Over time, the range of acceptable positions narrowed not through prohibition, but through preference. For many party members, this evolution felt natural. The electorate appeared cautious, focused on rebuilding personal lives rather than redefining national purpose. Leaders responded accordingly, shaping messages that emphasized reassurance and order. The memory of recent upheaval encouraged restraint, yet for those who had hoped the post-war moment might produce broader transformation, this narrowing felt like a quiet loss. The sense of possibility that had briefly flourished began to fade, replaced by pragmatism. Ideals gave way to administration. Vision yielded to management. These internal shifts influenced how the party engaged with broader debates. Language became more careful. Proposals were framed to avoid controversy. The emphasis moved toward consensus building, even if that meant setting aside more expansive ideas. Unity was preserved, but at the cost of ambition. Importantly, this process was not universally recognized at the time. Many Americans perceived continuity rather than change. The party still spoke of progress, fairness, and responsibility. The differences lay in emphasis rather than principle. Subtlety, rather than conflict, defined the moment. Within this environment, voices advocating broader international cooperation or deeper economic reform found fewer opportunities to shape policy. Their ideas were not rejected outright. They simply lost urgency. The national conversation moved on, guided by concerns that felt more immediate. This evolution reflected a broader pattern in post-war American life. Institutions across the country favored predictability. Businesses, communities, and governments alike sought steady ground. Political parties, responsive to these preferences, adjusted their internal dynamics accordingly. As evenings passed quietly in homes across the nation, these shifts unfolded far from public view. They did not disrupt daily routines or dominate headlines. Yet they influenced the direction of policy and the tone of leadership, shaping choices that would echo in later years. The Democratic Party's internal transition during this period serves as a reminder that history often turns through moderation rather than drama. Decisions made to preserve stability can also limit possibility. The balance between unity and vision is delicate, and choices made quietly can have lasting effects. For listeners resting tonight, this chapter offers a gentle reflection on how institutions adapt after moments of crisis. It illustrates how the desire for calm can reshape priorities and how ideas once central can gradually move to the margins without formal rejection. In the stillness of the post-war years, the party chose steadiness. The path forward seemed clear, even if narrower than some had hoped. And as the nation settled into a new phase of peace, these internal adjustments quietly shaped the future one, careful step at a time as the United States moved deeper into the post-war era. The Republican Party also entered a period of reassessment. The war years had reshaped political assumptions across the nation, and no major institution emerged unchanged. For Republicans, the challenge was to define a role in a country that was no longer responding to crisis, but adjusting to responsibility. During the war, political differences had softened in the face of necessity. Cooperation had been essential, and many traditional divisions were temporarily set aside. When peace returned, however, the space for debate reopened. The question was not whether change would occur, but what form it would take within the Republican Party. There was a growing sense that clarity and caution would resonate with the public. Americans, after years of upheaval, appeared eager for predictability. Stability, rather than experimentation, seemed to offer reassurance. Party leaders took note of this mood and adjusted their language accordingly. This adjustment did not happen abruptly. It unfolded gradually through speeches, policy positions, and campaign strategies. Emphasis shifted toward themes of fiscal responsibility, efficiency, and order. These ideas were presented calmly, framed as practical responses to a changing world rather than ideological statements. Anti-communism, while not new, began to take on a more defined role in Republican thinking. It was framed less as an abstract concern and more as a matter of security and vigilance. The tone remained measured, avoiding alarm, but the message was clear: stability required awareness of potential risks. This approach appealed to voters who valued certainty. After years of global conflict, many Americans were wary of ambiguity. Clear boundaries and firm principles offered comfort. The Republican strategy aimed to provide that comfort without invoking fear. Economic policy also reflected this shift. Republicans emphasized the importance of private enterprise, competition, and restrained government involvement. These positions were presented as safeguards against instability rather than critiques of recent policies. The focus remained on balance and sustainability. Importantly, this evolving strategy did not reject cooperation outright. Instead, it redefined it. Cooperation was framed within limits, guided by caution. International engagement, for example, was supported when it aligned with security and economic interests. Ideals were weighed against perceived risk. Within the party, there were diverse viewpoints. Some members favored broader international cooperation, drawing on wartime experiences. Others urged a more reserved approach. Over time, the latter perspective gained prominence. Reflecting both internal dynamics and public sentiment, this shift influenced how Republicans interacted with bipartisan discussions. Agreement was possible, but it was approached selectively. The emphasis was on safeguarding established systems rather than expanding them. This stance reinforced the party's image as a stabilizing force. For the public, these changes were often subtle. Campaign messages emphasized reliability and experience. Speeches avoided dramatic promises, The language of caution blended smoothly into a national mood shaped by fatigue and hope for calm. Media coverage mirrored this tone. Republican positions were discussed as part of a broader adjustment rather than a sharp departure. The absence of dramatic conflict contributed to a sense of continuity, even as priorities evolved. This strategic refinement also reflected lessons drawn from recent history. The economic collapse of the 1930s and the global instability that followed had demonstrated the consequences of imbalance. Republicans sought to position themselves as guardians against such outcomes. At the same time, this emphasis on caution narrowed the space for more expansive visions. Ideas centered on long-term transformation received less attention. Practical management took precedence over philosophical debate. For many Americans, this approach felt appropriate. They were focused on rebuilding personal lives, securing homes, and planning for the future. Political messages that promised steadiness aligned with these goals. Evenings across the country were marked by routine rather than urgency. Families listened to news reports that spoke of policy shifts in measured tones. The political environment, while active, did not intrude forcefully into daily life. This period illustrates how strategy can evolve quietly, shaped by context rather than confrontation. The Republican Party's post-war adjustment reflected a broader national desire for order and reassurance. For listeners tonight, this chapter offers a reminder that political change is not always dramatic. Sometimes it moves slowly, guided by mood and memory. The choices made during these years did not announce themselves loudly, but they influenced the direction of debate and the balance of ideas. As the nation continued to adjust to peace, this evolving strategy became part of the larger pattern shaping American public life: steady, cautious, and attentive to the lessons of recent history. As the late 1940s progressed, a gradual shift took place in how Americans understood security, stability, and peace. The hopeful language of cooperation that had shaped the immediate post-war years did not disappear overnight. Instead, it was slowly joined and then increasingly overshadowed by a more cautious way of thinking. This approach came to be known in broad terms as containment. Containment was not a single decision or policy announced at one clear moment. It was a mindset that developed quietly, shaped by uncertainty and the weight of recent history. After witnessing how quickly global instability could escalate into conflict, American leaders and institutions grew more attentive to risk. The emphasis moved from imagining ideal outcomes to preventing worst-case scenarios. For many Americans, this shift felt reasonable. The war had demonstrated the consequences of delayed response and underestimated threats. While the desire for cooperation remained, it was now balanced by a growing belief that peace required vigilance. Stability, it seemed, could not be assumed. It had to be protected. Public discussion of these ideas was measured. Officials spoke carefully, choosing words that reassured rather than alarmed. The language of prevention entered speeches and reports. Rather than emphasizing transformation or unity, conversations focused on boundaries, safeguards, and balance. This change in tone influenced how international relationships were understood. Engagement with the world continued, but it was framed more strategically. Cooperation was evaluated through the lens of security. Partnerships were encouraged when they aligned with long-term stability and caution. At home, this mindset subtly reshaped political and cultural expectations. Americans were encouraged to value preparedness and awareness. These qualities were presented as responsible and prudent, not fearful. The goal was to avoid future conflict by maintaining equilibrium. Media coverage reflected this shift. News reports increasingly emphasized developments abroad that might affect national security. These stories were delivered calmly, without urgency, but they contributed to a growing awareness that peace was fragile. The world was no longer viewed solely through the lens of recovery, but also through the possibility of disruption. Educational institutions adapted as well. Curricula expanded to include discussions of global affairs and civic responsibility. Students were encouraged to think critically about international relationships and long-term consequences. This education aimed to prepare citizens for a complex world rather than promise simplicity. Within government, containment thinking influence planning and policy. Resources were allocated with prevention in mind. Diplomatic efforts emphasized stability and predictability. The goal was not confrontation, but control, ensuring that tensions did not escalate into open conflict. For the public, these developments were often distant. Daily life continued much as before. Families focused on work, education, and community. The broader strategic shifts occurred quietly, rarely interrupting routine. Yet they shaped the environment in which decisions were made. This new emphasis also affected how unity was defined. In the immediate post-war years, unity had been associated with shared optimism and cooperation. Under containment thinking, unity became linked to agreement on caution and restraint. Consensus formed around the need to avoid extremes. Some Americans welcomed this clarity. Clear priorities offered reassurance. Others sensed that something had changed, that the openness of earlier years was narrowing. But these impressions remained subtle, rarely expressed openly. Importantly, containment thinking did not erase earlier ideals. It reframed them. Cooperation was still valued, but it was approached carefully. Trust was extended selectively. The emphasis was on maintaining balance rather than pursuing broad visions. Evenings across the country remained calm. Radios carried reports of diplomatic developments in steady voices. These updates were informative rather than dramatic. For many listeners, they blended into the background of daily life, reinforcing a sense of order. Over time, this mindset became familiar. Vigilance was normalized. Caution felt responsible. The idea that peace required active management became widely accepted. This acceptance did not come through fear, but through gradual adjustment. For listeners resting tonight, this chapter of history offers a quiet lesson. It shows how nations respond to uncertainty, not always through bold declarations, but through shifts in tone and priority. The rise of containment thinking was less about abandoning hope and more about redefining it. Hope, in this context, meant avoiding catastrophe. It meant sustaining stability rather than pursuing ideal outcomes. This approach shaped decisions for decades, influencing how unity, security, and responsibility were understood. As the nation moved forward, containment became part of its institutional memory. It guided policy and conversation, often without being named. And while it narrowed some possibilities, it also provided a framework for managing a complicated world in the stillness of the post-war years. This new way of thinking settled quietly into place, steady, cautious, and enduring, shaping the path ahead without announcing itself loudly. There was no single moment when the post-war vision of unity disappeared from American life. No announcement, no formal rejection, no clear turning point. Instead, the idea faded slowly, almost gently, like a familiar sound that becomes part of the background and then gradually goes unnoticed. By the early 1950s, the language of unity was still present, but its meaning had subtly changed. In the immediate aftermath of the war, unity had felt expansive. It suggested cooperation across differences, patience with complexity, and confidence in shared purpose. Over time, however, daily concerns reshaped priorities. Economic adjustments, political recalibration, and global uncertainty drew attention, away from broad ideals and toward more specific goals. This transition was quiet because it aligned with human instinct. After years of strain, Americans wanted calm. Stability mattered more than vision. Predictability felt safer than possibility. In such an environment, ideals that required ongoing effort and imagination gradually lost prominence. Public discourse reflected this shift. Speeches still referenced cooperation, but increasingly in limited terms. Unity was discussed as agreement on fundamentals, rather than exploration of shared future. The emphasis moved toward consensus through caution rather than collaboration through openness. Media coverage adapted as well. Stories focused on management, security, and growth. The earlier emphasis on reconstruction and reconciliation gave way to reports on strategy and preparedness. These changes were not abrupt. They evolved alongside public interest. In institutions, the unity ideal encountered practical constraints. Policies required clarity and enforceability. Broad visions were difficult to translate into action without risking disagreement. Over time, administrators favored approaches that minimized uncertainty. Even if they limited ambition, education mirrored these adjustments. Civic lessons emphasized responsibility and order. The language of shared destiny softened into lessons about structure and obligation. Students learned to value stability, reflecting the priorities of the society around them. At home, families continued to thrive within routines shaped by prosperity and caution. The earlier sense of collective endeavor gave way to individualized planning. Success became personal, measured through stability and progress within one's own sphere. This shift was natural and widely accepted, yet beneath this acceptance, something subtle had changed. The idea that the nation might move forward together in a deeply collaborative way no longer felt urgent. Cooperation was still valued, but it was compartmentalized, applied where necessary, set aside where complicated. Internationally, this narrowing of unity was reflected in policy language. Partnerships were framed strategically. Trust was conditional. The broad aspiration of shared global purpose yielded to careful management of relationships. For most Americans, these developments were distant. Daily life remained calm. Communities functioned. The disappearance of the unity ideal did not disrupt routines or provoke concern. It happened gradually, woven into the fabric of normalcy. This quiet fading illustrates how ideals can dissolve without opposition. When circumstances change, attention shifts. What once felt essentially becomes optional. Over time, the absence is barely noticed. Importantly, the unity ideal was not proven wrong. It was simply set aside. The nation chose approaches that felt more manageable, more certain. This choice reflected context rather than failure. In moments of reflection, however, traces of the earlier vision remained. In speeches, in writing, in memory, they lingered as reminders of a moment when cooperation felt within reach. For listeners tonight, this chapter offers a gentle observation about history. Change does not always arrive with force. Sometimes it settles quietly, reshaping expectations without demanding acknowledgement. The disappearance of the unity ideal did not mark an end, but a transition. It led the nation toward a different understanding of cohesion, one based on caution and control rather than openness and trust. As the country moved forward, these choices shaped public life in lasting ways. Yet the memory of unity remained, resting quietly beneath the surface, waiting for moments of reflection like this one, in the stillness of night. It is enough to notice that such moments existed, that history once paused at a crossroads where cooperation felt possible, even if it was not sustained. And with that recognition, the story continues softly, patiently carrying forward the echoes of what was once imagined. Even as the world chose another path, the years immediately following the Second World War passed quietly into history. But the choices made during that period did not remain there. They carried forward, shaping attitudes, institutions, and expectations in ways that became clearer only with time. What began as subtle adjustments in tone and priority gradually settled into lasting patterns, echoing across later decades of American life. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, divisions had not appeared dramatic. They were expressed through cautious language, careful policy, and restrained ambition. Because these changes unfolded gently, they were often accepted without resistance. Stability felt more important than examination. Yet these early decisions established frameworks that influenced how disagreement and cooperation would be handled in the future. Political discourse, for example, became increasingly structured around boundaries. The earlier openness to broad discussion narrowed. Over time, positions hardened not through sudden conflict, but through repetition. Ideas that once circulated freely were now filtered through established categories. This shift shaped how debates were framed and understood. Institutions adapted accordingly. Government agencies, educational systems, and media organizations developed habits rooted in caution. These habits favored predictability and control. While they provided order, they also reduced flexibility. The legacy of this approach persisted, influencing responses to later challenges. Economic life reflected similar patterns. The emphasis on efficiency and productivity, introduced quietly in the post-war years, became central to later economic thinking. Growth was pursued with focus, but often without the broader context of shared experience that had once accompanied it. This emphasis shaped expectations around work and success. Community life evolved as well. Neighborhoods grew, routines solidified, and individual achievement gained prominence. Cooperation remained part of social life, but it was increasingly localized. The sense of national collaboration that had briefly emerged gave way to more segmented forms of connection. Education continued to emphasize order and responsibility. Civic lessons focused on structure and adherence rather than exploration. These priorities prepared students for stability, but they also shaped how future generations approached difference and change. Internationally, the legacy of early divisions influenced how the United States engaged with the world. Relationships were managed strategically. Trust was extended cautiously. The expansive hopes of earlier years were replaced by frameworks designed to maintain balance. This approach proved durable, guiding policy through shifting circumstances. Over time, these patterns became familiar. They shaped public expectations. Disagreement was anticipated. Unity was defined narrowly. These assumptions influenced how Americans responded to new challenges, often without conscious awareness of their origins. Importantly, these echoes were not inherently negative. Stability provided resilience. Institutions functioned effectively. The nation navigated complex periods without collapse. Yet the cost of this resilience was a reduced capacity for shared imagination. Moments of crisis occasionally revived broader visions of cooperation, reminding Americans of earlier possibilities. But these moments were often temporary, constrained by the established habits of caution. For listeners tonight, this chapter offers perspective on how history operates. The past does not simply end. It continues through patterns and expectations. Early divisions, once normalized, become part of the background. The post-war period illustrates how choices made to preserve calm can shape long-term direction. By prioritizing stability, the nation gained order but lost some openness. These trade-offs were not fully understood at the time, but their effects accumulated. In daily life, these legacies manifested subtly. Political conversations carried assumptions shaped decades earlier. Economic debates reflected priorities set long before. Cultural narratives echoed themes of caution and control, yet history is not static. Awareness of these echoes allows for reflection. Understanding how early divisions shaped later decades opens space for reconsideration as night settles and the mind grows quiet. It is enough to recognize that the past continues to influence the present, not through force, but through habit. The echoes of early decisions remind us that history is ongoing, shaped by both action and restraint. In this stillness, the story invites gentle contemplation. The paths chosen long ago remain with us, offering lessons not of blame, but of understanding. And with understanding comes the possibility, quiet and unhurried, imagining alternatives. Should the moment ever return? As the long arc of the post-war years settles into history, what remains is not a single decision or moment, but a feeling soft, distant, and difficult to define. It is the feeling of a possibility once sensed and then gradually set aside. Not abandoned in anger, nor defeated by failure, but gently replaced by other priorities that felt more manageable at the time, in the immediate years after the Second World War. Americans briefly shared a vision shaped by cooperation and restraint. It was a vision born not of idealism alone, but of experience. People had lived through hardship together. They had learned that collective effort could achieve extraordinary results. From that knowledge grew a quiet hope that unity might continue to guide the nation forward. Over time, that hope did not disappear so much as it softened. The demands of daily life returned. Institutions adjusted to peacetime realities. Economic growth introduced new expectations. Global uncertainty encouraged caution. Each step felt reasonable, even necessary. And yet, with each adjustment, the earlier sense of shared purpose moved slightly further into the background. What was lost then was not unity itself, but its breadth. Cooperation remained, but it became more selective. Trust persisted, but it was increasingly conditional. The expansive idea that differences could be navigated through patience and shared responsibility narrowed into more defined frameworks. This shift was understandable. Nations, like individuals, seek stability after disruption. Predictability offers comfort. Structure reduces anxiety. In choosing caution, the United States preserved order during a complex period of transition. That achievement should not be minimized. At the same time, history invites us to notice what caution can quietly set aside. The earlier willingness to imagine broader cooperation required openness and risk. It asked for patience with uncertainty. Over time, those qualities became harder to sustain amid changing circumstances. The legacy of this transition is subtle. It lives not in specific policies, but in habits of thought, in how disagreement is approached, in how unity is defined. These habits shape expectations, often without conscious awareness. For many Americans, this story is not one of loss in a dramatic sense. Life improved. Opportunities expanded. Stability increased. Yet beneath these gains lies a quieter question. What possibilities were deferred? Not because they failed, but because they required continued imagination. This reflection is not an invitation to judgment. The people of the post-war years made decisions within their context, guided by memory and necessity. They sought peace, security, and progress. In many ways, they succeeded. What remains valuable is the awareness that history contains. Moments of openness, brief intervals when alternatives feel possible. These moments do not demand action. They simply remind us that paths diverge. Often quietly, in remembering the vanished vision of unity, we do not seek to recreate the past. Instead, we acknowledge that such visions have existed before. They arose from shared experience and mutual respect. They faded not because they were unrealistic, because attention shifted elsewhere. As night deepens and the mind grows calm, this reflection can rest gently. It asks nothing of the listener. It offers no conclusions. It simply invites awareness. History, after all, is not only a record of events, it is also a record of possibilities, some realized, others left unexplored. By noticing what was once imagined, we gain perspective on the present. The story of America's lost fight for unity is not a tale of defeat. It is a reminder of choice, of how societies navigate uncertainty, of how priorities evolve. And in this quiet understanding, there is comfort. The past does not dictate the future. It informs it. The visions once held remain part of the national memory, waiting quietly, like echoes, ready to be remembered when circumstances allow. For now, it is enough to let this story settle gently. To rest with the knowledge that unity has been felt before, even briefly, and that remembering it in stillness is itself a form of connection. As sleep arrives, the reflection fades into calm, leaving behind not regret, but understanding.